There's a photograph from 1949 that most railroad historians have seen. It shows Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive number 6100 sitting in a scrapyard waiting to be cut up. It was the longest rigid-frame steam locomotive ever built and one of the largest and heaviest passenger locomotives of its era. It was a 140-foot machine that pushed rigid-frame steam design past practical limits. It had the only 644 six-wheel arrangement in history. Historical cost data shows the S1 construction cost exceeded that of both the prototype and production series T1 locomotives on a per-unit basis. Back in 1937, the Pennsylvania Railroad Board had authorized $300,000 for an experimental high-speed passenger locomotive. By the time 6100 was finished, the bill had grown to $669,780, around $15 million in today's money. They believed it would revolutionize passenger rail. Instead, it spent most of its service life effectively limited to a single 283-mile main line between Chicago and Crestline, unable to operate over most of the Pennsylvania Railroad network. According to multiple documented discussions, the board considered preserving it, but by 1949, the railroad's finances were collapsing, and 6100 went to the scrappers. No ceremony, no farewell, just gone. Everyone talks about how the T1 failed. 52 locomotives were built, and all were scrapped by 1956. $14 million wasted. But this single experimental locomotive's failure reveals something worse. Understanding why tells you everything about what went wrong with American steam in its final years. In 1936, the Pennsylvania Railroad had a problem. The K4 Pacific locomotives, 425 built between 1914 and 1928, could not handle modern passenger trains anymore. Double heading became standard. 2 locomotives, 2 crews, twice the coal for one train. New York Central was running 464 Hudsons. Other railroads had massive 484 Northerns. The Pennsylvania Railroad looked outdated. Baldwin Locomotive Works convinced them to try the duplex drive. Instead of 8 coupled driving wheels, they split them into 2 sets of 4. Each set got its own cylinders. Everything sat on one rigid frame. The engineering made sense. Smaller cylinders meant lighter reciprocating parts and less hammer blow on the track. You could theoretically run faster without shaking the railroad apart. But the railroad made a critical mistake. They wanted this locomotive to match their GG1 electrics, capable of hauling 1,000 tons at 100 miles per hour. That required over 4,000 horsepower. So Baldwin and the Pennsylvania Railroad kept adding length, weight, and driving wheels. By June 1937, the design evolved from a 4444 into a 6446, with a 6-wheel leading truck, 2 sets of 4 drivers, and a 6-wheel trailing truck. Number 6100 was completed at Altoona on December 21, 1938. That same day, they ran tests, running backward to Huntingdon, checking clearances on every curve. The overhang was extreme. At 140 feet, 2.5 inches overall, the S1 was 8 feet longer than Big Boy. Except Big Boy was articulated, and the S1 was a rigid frame. Some locomotives could bend. The S1 couldn't. It had a 140-foot rigid frame. It couldn't fit on most Pennsylvania Railroad turntables. It couldn't navigate curves into most rail yards. In August 1941, the Pennsylvania Railroad had to extend a stall at the Crestline roundhouse specifically for this locomotive. Even then, the S1 could only be turned on a Y, a triangular track junction. The Pennsylvania Railroad had just built a locomotive that could only operate over a small fraction of their own mainline network. The Pennsylvania Railroad decided to salvage what they could. If 6100 couldn't work over their system, they'd use it for publicity. The 1939 New York World's Fair was opening. 27 Eastern railroads were sharing a massive exhibit. The Pennsylvania Railroad contributed their experimental locomotive. Getting it there was a nightmare. The S1 took a roundabout route over the Long Island Railroad. 3rd rail guards were temporarily removed. The locomotive was towed backward by smaller engines. At the fair, they mounted 6100 on a platform with rollers under the driving wheels. The locomotive ran under its own steam, wheels spinning at what would be 60 miles per hour on actual track. Visitors watched the massive machine operate while going nowhere, a striking display for a locomotive whose operational limitations prevented system-wide usefulness. When the World's Fair closed in October 1940, the Pennsylvania Railroad finally put 6100 into revenue service in December 1940. Between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio, a stretch of 283 miles. The wheel slip problems became undeniable. If the T1 had a reputation for wheel slip, the S1 was worse on paper. More than half its weight sat on the trucks instead of the drivers. Only 47% of the total weight rested on the 8 driving wheels. The other 53% sat on those massive 6-wheel leading and trailing trucks. More than half the locomotive's weight did nothing for traction. Just dead weight. Old Machine Press was blunt about the problem, noting that the majority of the engine's weight rested on the trucks rather than the drive wheels, and that this was perhaps the engine's biggest issue. The T1 had wheel slip problems too. Improper training and faulty spring equalization contributed, but those were issues you could potentially solve. The S1's wheel slip was built into the design from the start. Operational records indicate the S1 regularly logged over 10,000 miles per month during wartime service, though this high utilization did not mitigate its inherent routing restrictions or traction limitations. But that did not change the fact that it could only earn that mileage on a single stretch of railroad 283 miles long. The Pennsylvania Railroad built S1, one single experimental unit. Cost was $669,780. Service life was roughly 6 years. Operational range was 283 miles. Then the Pennsylvania Railroad built 52 T1 locomotives. 2 prototypes in 1942 cost $600,000. 50 production units in 1945 to 1946 cost $14,125,000, $282,500 each. Total construction cost was $14,725,000. Construction records place the S1 per unit cost at more than double that of the T1 prototype units. But here is what is damning. Before the S1 ever entered regular service, the railroad had already decided not to build a second one. In June 1940, they ordered 2 T1 prototypes instead. Focus had shifted to the smaller, more practical 444 design. Then in December 1944, with the T1 prototype showing numerous teething problems and being prone to wheel slip, the railroad board authorized 50 production T1s anyway. One prototype had shown fundamental design limits, and the railroad did not commission a second unit. Despite persistent wheel slip and mechanical issues identified in the T1 prototypes, the railroad proceeded with production. The Pennsylvania Railroad proceeded with a production order of 50 additional units. The S1's failure was honest. The railroad tried something radical, it did not work, and they stopped. The T1's failure was worse because the Pennsylvania Railroad kept investing in a concept they knew had issues. By May 5, 1946, the S1 was done. Crew records show an engineer's time book documents a run by locomotive 6100 at 8:59 a.m. May 5, 1946. That was likely its last revenue run. Less than 2 years later, Pennsylvania Railroad President Martin W. Clement announced all through passenger trains would be dieselized. The T1s ended up on mail trains and secondary service. By 1949, some were withdrawn. By 1952, all were out of service. Scrapping began in 1951 and finished in 1956. The S1 sat in a scrapyard for 3 years while the Pennsylvania Railroad Board discussed preservation. The railroad's finances were collapsing. In 1949, they scrapped it. 52 T1 locomotives, $14 million, less than a decade, all scrapped. One S1, $669,780, roughly 6 years. Scrapped. Both were disasters. But the S1 failure was clean. Pennsylvania Railroad recognized the problem, cut losses, and moved on. The T1 failure was prolonged. Persistent wheel slip, suspension-related imbalance, and high-speed valve gear stresses across multiple systems kept causing trouble. The S1 failed because it was simply too big for the railroad that built it. The T1 failed because the Pennsylvania Railroad refused to admit the duplex concept had fundamental issues. In 2014, the T1 Steam Locomotive Trust started building T1 number 5550. Target completion is 2030, and the cost was $7 million. Nobody is building an S1. Some failures are so complete that even enthusiasts will not touch them. The S1 was powerful, fast, and beautifully streamlined. Contemporary operational accounts document the S1 surpassing 100 miles per hour, although no dynamometer car recording was ever made. Anecdotal claims of higher speeds exist, but none were supported by instrumented testing or official timing. It could not turn on its own railroad's turntables. It could only operate on 283 miles of track. Construction data confirms the per-unit cost of the S1 exceeded that of both the prototype and the production T1s, while its operational lifespan and route availability were substantially more limited. The PRR S1 failed worse than the T1, not because it was less capable, because it proved that bigger does not mean better. Sometimes pushing technology too far just means you have built something the world cannot use, and sometimes the world was never going to be ready for it.